Vikram, you may be a bit surprised, but I must say I'm very happy to see so many people. First of all, namaskara to all of you. You are here on a Sunday morning to listen to a foreign minister. And I think maybe it's a good idea to ask yourselves why. I think you are here because somewhere each one of you actually realizes that the world matters to you much more than it did before, much more than you thought it did before, and there are very good reasons for it. I think somewhere in your mind, probably also you are here because in the last decade, the Modi government has done things and, changed the country in ways in which an average citizen suddenly has got more involved, more interested. And therefore, what the government thinks about foreign policy. So it's not just that the world matters more to you, but it's also that what is the government's approach, what are our concerns, how do we, in a sense, put forward the interests of our country. I think that also matters to you more. And third, my sense is that perhaps you are all much more conscious of the importance of choices that you make in a democratic society. And you want to make informed choices. You would like to know everything that is going around, then make up your own mind what you believe is good for you, good for your community, good for your city, good for your state, good for your country. So with that set of assumptions in my mind, let me actually reflect on the first point, which is why does the world matter more to you? If I were to pick a single example of that, it would obviously be what happened to all of us during the COVID pandemic. A COVID pandemic, because if I had come here in December of 2019 and told all of you that something is happening somewhere else in the world and our next few years are going to be consumed by this, none of you would have believed me. Actually, I wouldn't have believed it myself, so I wouldn't have told you that. And yet, if you look at the last few years, whether it was the pandemic itself, how we responded, what we tried to get from the world, what the world gave us, what difference did we make, I think it was truly in many ways a global experience. But within that experience, there were very important lessons. We are, today holding the presidency of the G20. Now, when the seriousness of the COVID was visible, very early in the year 2020. Now, during this period, we responded. And a country which at the beginning of 2020 was importing, as I said, the very basics for dealing with COVID. Actually, by the middle of 2020, had started producing enough for itself and also started actually sending it outside. And if there was one country at that time which stepped up in terms of how to expand, because the COVID actually put a huge stress on the medical requirements of the world. So it could be, at that time, hydroxychloroquine, which many of you will remember, but even something as very basic as paracetamol. The global demand for paracetamol went up by multiple X. So how do you produce more, and even that, which means how do you source the base drugs from other places? So you had actually creating facilities at home. You had your responsibility as an exporter outside. You had the worries about Indians who were stuck, because many of, students, for example, or tourists, many of them actually were stuck without any money and without the flights to bring them back. How do you organize this? And when I look back upon it, to me, whether the fact that we brought back 70 lakh Indians, 70 lakh Indians. So, and the interesting thing, there was this great concept during COVID called work from home. Okay, it's a good concept. I mean, it was necessary. Now, when you are busy trying to bring back 70 million Indians, 70 lakh Indians, for us in the foreign ministry was try to get home occasionally. Because actually we started probably for the first time in our history, started working like a factory in shifts. That we created 8-hour teams and said, because somewhere somebody was stuck 24 hours a day. So if you have to all the time, because you are now an exporter, you are a sourcer, you are a travel agent, you are an airline scheduler, you are a ship mover. So I would say our skill sets expanded, our sense of what we could do grew. So, with the passage of time, I used to meet other foreign ministers who would tell me, now my foreign ministry is thinking of coming back to work. I would look at them and say, well, my foreign ministry is thinking maybe we need to go home from time to time. But I say this to you because what happened during this period was an India which, under stress, showed that we had a potential in us, that we could actually in different ways look after our citizens at home, look after our citizens abroad, and also step up for the rest of the world. Now, when I say step up for the rest of the world, what does that mean? I spoke about sending out medicines. We sent out medicines. A lot of it was business. Okay, I mean, people paid, we shipped, but many countries couldn't pay. Overall, at that time, we sent out medicines to 150 out of almost 200 countries in the world. Many were developed countries. But the real thing, the real difference we made was actually in vaccines. Now, vaccines is also something which all of us as citizens should reflect on. Because if we look back at the last 20, 30, 40 years, there was some problem. We knew, we would read in the newspaper like his, that somebody somewhere invented a drug, a medicine, a vaccine. Then we said, okay, one day it will come to us also, we will wait our turn. This time around, actually two very interesting things happened. There was one vaccine, which many of you would have taken, the AstraZeneca one, which was made across the world, but made with the greatest volume and efficiency actually in India. And that itself is a testament to what India was capable of. But the second, which was equally interesting, was that you had not only a made in India vaccine, you had an invented in India vaccine. That actually people were taking vaccines which were produced here, which were tested here, whose efficacy, I'm a standing example of that. That during the whole COVID period, I think Prime Minister was the first among the ministers to take it. I think I was the second. But I say this as people during COVID, where our job responsibility was actually to go to hospitals, to go to places where COVID was most like, we used to go to the concentrated centers of infection. And yet, I would say that, at least for 2 years, maybe there was some natural immunity, but at least for 2 years, I would say I at least kept COVID at bay. Now, I say this to you because it's a very graphic illustration. It's an illustration of the dangers that the world poses, the opportunities the world has, the compulsions of interacting with the world. But at the end of it all, from my perspective of foreign policy. Today, for me, the biggest, I would say, the biggest plus point I have, the biggest goodwill I have with the rest of the world was what we did in terms of vaccine Maitri. I just came back from a trip to South America. The countries I visited 4 of them. It was the first time any foreign minister of India had been there. I met all the foreign ministers of the Caribbean community. There are 15 countries there. And the foreign ministers of Central America. There are 7 of them. They all came at short notice to meet me. And one of the reasons they came was they wanted to come and express the personal thanks that these 20-odd countries located in America, the opposite end of the world, the first vaccines that they got was actually from India. First vaccine. And in fact, one particular country, Dominican Republic, this is the place for those of you interested where Christopher Columbus first landed and he thought it was India. Okay, so when I was walking down, to see a little bit between the meetings, where Columbus was, where did he live, etc. You actually got stopped in the street by completely ordinary people. I mean, from people who ran shops, to tour guides, to taxi, drivers, who would actually come and say, they spoke Spanish, I can follow a little bit, but there, through expressions, it was conveyed to me very, very clearly, vaccine, thank you, your chief, so they did this, so I also understood what this meant. And I want to say today that the response which we did during COVID and the reach out that we did during COVID today, it actually has had an extraordinary impact on the world. So let me switch gears and then come to something which Vikram spoke about. We have just completed the Operation Kaveri. If there's still somewhere some people still stuck, obviously we would make that additional effort. But remember, Operation Kaveri was not a one-off. It was a particularly complicated operation. For various reasons, we were hesitant to speak about it too much in public. It wasn't just probity and a sense of responsibility. I was actually genuinely worried that if we highlighted the predicament in which our people were, we would be putting them in danger. So during this period, from April 15th, when it started, we've been working very, I would say, efficiently, but very much with not too much details in the public domain. In many ways, you can contrast it with some of the earlier operations. Now, in the case of Operation Kaveri, we brought back almost 4,000 people, and broadly about 11–12% of them were inhabitants of Karnataka state. This was done using the Air Force. There were 17 flights. We used the Navy. There were 5 sorties by ships. But having seen a series of these operations from 2015 when we did the Yemen Operation Rahat, actually this was the most dangerous operation. It was an operation where people put their lives at risk, where there were quite a few embassies in Khartoum. When the fighting started, most of the embassies left very quickly. Our embassy stayed. Our embassy stayed because there were Indians in Khartoum. And I finally had to, when all the Indians had left, even then my embassy was there. My embassy was there because my ambassador and his team had that sense of responsibility. They said, no, there's still people stuck in different places. And I finally, on the day when the ceasefire broke down, I actually had to order them saying, you're putting your lives at risk. Please relocate within Sudan. And the kind of challenges, and bit by bit, story will come out. You actually had an Air Force plane land at a, I would say, not an unprepared airstrip, but an airstrip which was not regularly functional, in very poor condition, where a plane previously coming in had been shot up, had been fired at and hit. And yet these people took the risk of landing there with very little help from the, I think the air traffic controller was non-existent, I think if my understanding is right. So they landed there in a sense using old-fashioned skills, taking a big chance. And, to me, whether the courage shown by the people landing was only matched with the courage shown by the embassy staff on the ground who had rounded up the people and taken them there through very difficult circumstances so that they could be very quickly loaded on the plane, and the embassy people came back. And those who left. Now, I say this to you because, sitting here, and sometimes, as I said, there are times we can speak about it, we can share details. There are times when people need to trust the government, need to understand today that this is a government which has systems in place, which has a commitment to citizens abroad. So, in fact, when Sudan, the fighting started, I was myself traveling. And within a matter of a few hours, the Prime Minister contacted me. He wanted to, I was in Africa at that time, contacted me. He wanted to confirm. We had set up a crisis management group. Our systems were coming in place. We were reaching out through the ambassadors to all the countries concerned. And that we were getting the Air Force and the Navy ready for movement for all of this to happen. Now, the whole operation was actually hugely complex. I'm speaking of 17 flights and 5 ships, but that is the final end of the operation that you are seeing. Actually, the people out there, the team handling it, had to hire buses, get petrol in the black market because the petrol, fuel was very difficult. Had to negotiate checkpoints. I think some of you would have seen stories in the newspaper of what the people who came out. They spoke about being threatened, about being robbed, about being assaulted. Whatever they went through, those who stayed behind took much more than that. And yet it was their job to keep it running. And, during this period, I would say maybe we had 60 to 70 buses. And people actually, the last lot of people traversed through the length of Sudan to finally reach the port through a very long route because they were avoiding the fighting. And we had another team which had to come from, we had people from Nigeria come to Chad and extricate people from the western side of Sudan. So why am I sharing these details with you? 2 reasons. Because so many of us go abroad, work abroad, live abroad at times, this is going to be a challenge for which we have to be always prepared. And when I look back at this last 10 years, just this year was Operation Kaveri, last year was Operation Ganga, year before was Operation Devi Shakti in Afghanistan. In fact, pretty much this 10 years, every year we've had at least one major operation. We had Operation Maitri with Nepal earthquake, we had Operation Rahat, we had Sankat Mochan in southern Sudan. So, in a way, I come back to what I'm telling you. Why does the world matter to us? The world matters to us because we are today more and more present in the world. And we have to have the relationships. For an evacuation like this, one part of it is the bit I shared with you. How many buses, how many planes, how many ships. One part of it is also the phone calls you make, the help you get from others. The Saudis, for example, helped us hugely. I had to call up the British because that particular airfield where our plane landed at that point of time was controlled by the British. I had to ask Egypt for help because some people went north, South Sudan because they went south, Chad because we had an extrication party out there, UAE because they had a very big influence on some of the forces who were fighting out there. So today we have to have in good days the relationships, the capabilities, the footprint, so that, God forbid, something happens. A country cannot start preparing from at the moment when disaster strikes or perils emerge. We have to be prepared well before, so that if something unforeseen or dangerous or catastrophic happens, to the extent any country can be ready, that country has to be ready. So for me, what I am doing abroad in terms of relationship building is one part of a much bigger change which this country is going through, where we are building capabilities, where is setting in place systems. And so, when we speak today of a changing world and a changing India, I use these two examples, COVID and this, Operation Kaveri. These are examples today of how different parts of the government came together. That if today a foreign minister can stand and say, we did this in that country and did this in this country, I can say that because the degree of support that I get from my other colleagues, the coordination within the government. Often I get asked saying, you're constantly dealing with one issue after another. What is the difference? And I've been in this business for 45 years. What is the difference today? Why didn't it happen earlier? Why didn't it happen so effectively and so rapidly earlier? I think one part of it is, as I said, this coordination and capability. But the other part of it is the motivation. I find actually, as someone who spent all his life working in the government, except 1 year, the change within the system itself is important for citizens to recognize. That if I have an ambassador who will not leave until every Indian has left, or, when we had this Operation Ganga going on, the last lot of students, they were in a very, I would say, dangerous position because they were in a city. Every time they tried to get out of their hostel, there would be some firing, they'd go back in. And finally, when we had arrangements in place, the students by that time were not willing to take a chance because they worried if they came out and somewhere something went wrong, they would not be able to be extricated. So to give them that courage, we actually had to send 2 senior officers from Delhi, saying you go all the way to Ukraine, go through that fighting, reach that place, tell the students, see, I've come from India, now come with me, get on that bus and come back with me. Now, the point I'm making here is, when I asked for people, I had no shortage of volunteers. And I sent 2 very senior people. And, when they were going, I still remember, I speak Russian. So they were going through checkpoints. Because when there's a war, when there's a conflict, there are checkpoints. At every checkpoint, they would get the same question. Everybody is traveling from east to the west, trying to run away from the conflict. Why are you crazy guys going towards the conflict? And, every time they would give some story because they didn't want to reveal that they were actually going on a mission to link up with the students. But I mentioned this to you because, the motivation today to want to change, to volunteer, to be part of a larger enterprise for national interest. So one part of it is, I would say, the capability. One part of it is today the mindset. One part of it is really a much tighter coordination. Now, I can give you many other examples of it. While doing so, I would also readily admit, it is not that we are without challenges, because we have done great things over the last 75 years, but we have also fallen short in many areas over the last 75 years. It could be political, it could be economic, it could be technology. I would personally say one area where we should have built much deeper strengths, supported our technology and our industry and our agriculture much more than we did. If today, often any discussion goes saying, look at what China is doing. To me, these examples show India is capable of many things. It needs the motivation. It needs the leadership. It needs that willingness to give the support and the ability to think for ourselves. I mean, if I were to switch, say, to the field of technology, to me, Covaxin was notable because it was invented in India vaccine. But we have today an Indian 5G, which is coming on stream. When I look at what 5G is doing, or what is happening, what we call India Stack, the entire, this digital revolution. When I go abroad, in fact, most, the area which interests most people is actually about what is happening digitally. They hear these stories. They hear today that, people get money in their bank accounts without 50% of it being lost on the way. They hear that food support is being given. They hear that there are housing programs where actually the intended beneficiary gets the house. Or that there are health programs which give you today, good quality, low cost health care. And when you tell them these numbers, the numbers I give are actually not just the size of a country, they're often the size of a continent, sometimes more than the size of a continent. So the image of India today is one, it's a pharmacy of the world, the vaccine Maitri, the first responder, the India Stack, the 5G, what we are doing in space. It's for a lot of countries, they follow it with a very deep interest. Again, I refer to my most recent visits. I was in Africa, and I took I went to Mozambique, and I went on a train which was made in India. And what the train had done, it wasn't just a train. It had given in the capital of Mozambique the possibility of creating a suburban rail system in an economical way, in which they could not have done it at a high cost if they had actually had high-cost partners or partners who give them stuff which doesn't work after a point, who will remain unnamed. So the point is that, I was in Guyana. They had just bought a ferry from the Garden Reach workshop in Calcutta. So the world today is seeing a different India of different capacities. So what we are doing at home, our governance, our digital delivery, our economic recovery, and most of all, I think what they value is actually the independence of mind. That they, at a time when there is so much polarization, when, there are pressures on you, when others see a country like India stand up for its people, to do what it thinks is the right thing in its best interest, we not only secure our interests, we actually give the rest of the world a lot of courage. And they, they feel so much more emboldened also to take, the positions which they believe is right. So for me today, the world, home, these lines are very, very blurred. What happens outside, what happens inside, how they impact each other, how much our lives have become intertwined, how global it is. So that is why, as I said, I'm happy to come here. I mean, I have a long association with Karnataka, but to come to the most globally connected state of the country, to come to a state which is actually a technology and manufacturing champion, which is a very major exporter at a time when actually our export levels are touching a record, which is a great source of talent, whose people are all over the world, and which is today really so much a part of our, I would say, cultural rise, because I've not spoken about it. But again, independence of thought and mind and position. That is one reason why countries respect India. But another reason is also that they see once again actually a civilization state rising, reclaiming its place. That, when they see, as I said, an India that is more Bharat, the rest of the world, believe me, takes notice of that. So once again, I thank you on a Sunday morning to have given me the privilege of sharing some thoughts. So I promise Vikram that I'll allow him to fire a few shots at me. And after that, I'll be very glad to open it up.
Thank you, sir, for introducing us to the government's foreign policy, the importance of vaccine diplomacy, and why it's important for us to be aware of our nation's foreign policies going forward. In your book, The India Way, you say that even 75 years later, we are still largely operating in a 1945 framework from which India was excluded. What do you mean by that? And what has changed now?
A lot of the global structures, starting with the United Nations, but not only the United Nations, were devised after the Second World War. Now, at the time of the Second World War, we're still a colony. In some way, in some organizations, we had a presence, but not the kind of presence that we would have had we been an independent country. So one part of it is we missed out on many things. We're not the only people who missed out. Large parts of Africa and Latin America also missed out. And that debate is primarily today centered around the reform of the United Nations. That's one part of it. The other part of it is really, the world coming out of 1945 is a very Western world. Western in the largest sense of the term. Because if you look even at the communist ideology, it is at the end of the day a Western ideology. So what are the norms, what are the rules, what are the practices? All these were really, in a sense, set in this Western culture, which had a left wing and a right wing, a liberal, conservative. I mean, you can dice it whichever way you can. So whether it is, in a sense, the structural, the hardwiring, or the software, I think both hardware and software are loaded against us. Today, our effort is actually how to introduce our own hardware and our own software at the same time. And it's a very tough one. But I believe it is happening. It is happening today that, when the G7 became the G20, it was one reflection of a change. I mean, it will not end there. There will be many other things that will happen. I mean, as I say quite openly about the UN, either the UN accommodates the change or the change will find non-UN ways of expressing itself. I mean, which will hurt the UN. So, but there's the software part, what is, you can say, what is cultural, when you define, freedoms, for example, when you define governance priorities. People look at it from the perspective of the old software inventors. So you would have, I mean, I'm giving you a very, very sort of a blunt example. I mean, in a country which has been pounded by terrorism from the moment of its birth, which is us. When other people say, oh, that's not important, what is important is you shouldn't shut down the internet under any circumstances. That's actually, there is both a political and a semi-cultural judgment out there. So how do you actually put your case? how do you convince other people? How do you get other countries to follow you? So, again, when my example I gave, the independence of mind during this whole Ukraine and the kind of pressures we came under, a lot of countries do not have the ability to say, yes, I will stand up and do what is right for my people. So, to me, there's both this hardware, software problem that faces us.
Since we're speaking of terrorism, you said that victims of terrorism do not sit together with perpetrators of terrorism to discuss terrorism. Yet the Pakistani foreign minister was invited to India for the SCO in Goa, where he said India is weaponizing terrorism to score diplomatic points. First, should we have invited Pakistan at all to the SCO summit in Goa? And second, how can we move forward if this is the attitude of Pakistan towards terror?
No, look, we invited the Pakistani foreign minister because there was an SCO foreign ministers meeting, and when it comes to multilateral meetings, you invite people to discuss that subject. Okay? So he was invited in his capacity as a representative of Pakistan to put across his views on matters pertaining to the SCO. We could differ, he may have his own viewpoint, I may have my own viewpoint. There's an SCO meeting room in which we would exchange, differ. That's one thing. But if you look at where his public utterances outside in the press conference and other interviews, he's not spoken about the SCO at all. He's spoken about everything else pertaining to India. He's spoken about our politics, he's spoken, his past value judgments, from Kashmir to G20 to BBC documentary. I mean, as I said, other than SCO, he's spoken about everything else. So now, what do I do as a host? See, if I have a guest who's a good guest, I'm a good host. But
Mr. Jaishankar, you have been the longest serving ambassador to China and are considered a specialist on Indo-China issues. Rahul Gandhi, in a TV interview, said, "You do not understand the threat from China." My question is, do such domestic criticism affect India's ability to negotiate at international forums?
See, I would have offered to take classes on China from Rahul Gandhi. But I discovered he was taking classes on China from the Chinese ambassador. So I asked myself, I may as well go to the original source and talk to them. Look, there is a lot. Unfortunately, foreign policy has become also an arena where, in some ways, I'm not innocent, okay? I'm not taking a view that there should not be politics. Today I'm in politics. I know everything in politics is political. I accept that. But I think on certain issues, we have a collective responsibility to at least behave in a way in which we do not weaken our collective position abroad. Okay? To do what we have seen in the last 3 years on China, because often very misleading narratives are put. There are misrepresentations. We had, for example, there was a big to-do about a bridge which the Chinese were building on Pangong Tso Lake, okay, in Ladakh. Now the reality, it was made out as though, see, you lost territory and they're building a bridge. No, the reality was that particular area, first the Chinese came in 1959 and then they occupied it in 1962. But that's not the way it was put across. This happened in case of some of the so-called model villages as well, that they were built on areas which we lost in 62 or before 62. Now, I don't believe, you will very rarely hear me say, 1962, that shouldn't have happened, or you are wrong, or you're responsible. I mean, what has happened has happened. It's our collective, I would say, failure or responsibility. I do not attribute necessarily a political coloring to it. What I would like to see is actually a serious China conversation. I'm prepared to accept that there are differences of viewpoints on that. But if you reduce it to a kind of slanging match, well, I mean, what can I say after that?
Since you just came back from the SEO conference in Goa, I'm reminded in 2000, last year, you were pushing for the port in Iran, where India would be very deeply involved in its development. I just want to know, why were you pushing so hard for it, and what is its strategic importance?
Look, I'm pushing hard for it because unless something miraculously changes in Pakistan, which I don't expect, I'll have to find a way around that to develop access to Central Asia and beyond. That is why a port in Iran is very important for us. Today there are ports. There is this port called Bandar Abbas in Iran, but it's a very congested port. We would like to have a port much closer to India, that is in eastern Iran, which, if we can work it out with the Iranians, can become a way by which goods can come from India to Central Asia and vice versa. It's been difficult in part because Iran also has come under sanctions. So, many of their companies, are problematic to deal with financially. But we have made steady progress. This time at the meeting, in fact, a lot of the Central Asians, there was, I don't want to mislead you, there was some serious business done in SEO meeting as well. It wasn't just what happened after the meeting. So they asked, a lot of them are very keen, saying, let's develop it. We are willing to chip in. People were interested in connecting their railway lines to what was coming out of that. So if I were to, say, give you a, 5-year, 10-year prediction, I'm sure this will be a very important connectivity sort of route, not just to Central Asia, possibly even to Russia, because we have a route called International North-South Transport Corridor, where we go through Iran, link up with, Azerbaijan, go northwards up there. And how to build your connectivity is today a very important part of diplomacy and international relations and international economics.
So most of the forums like SEO, BRICS, RIC are generally forums led by China. And how much influence does India have in these forums? And should we pay more attention to SAARC, a forum that we lead?
No, I don't agree with your first observation. I think there are forums in which we are members and China are members. I do not accept that one country necessarily leads it. I think it's a shared endeavor. Again, each country will try to push its own concepts and interests forward. We have to learn to compete with it. SAARC has a different problem. The issue with SAARC is that you have a member who's actually followed none of the basic rules of international relations. How to be a member of an organization, which a country, which not only conducts terrorism, but actually asserts its right to do so, is a problem. Okay, a country which says, I will not give you connectivity. What was happening earlier, for example, when our goods were going to Afghanistan, was we were not able to access Afghanistan, a fellow SAARC member, through Pakistan. Okay. A country which was not willing to give you MFN status when it comes to trade. So tell me, how does it make sense to pretend that something is working in a room if trade is not working, connectivity is not working, politics is not working, terrorism is working? Yeah. So I have I think a legitimate concern at that. So look, again, I put it to you this way. it's not in our interest to be locked into sort of perpetual hostility with Pakistan. Nobody wants that. It's against common sense. But somewhere, we also have to draw our red lines and, more important, stand by our red lines. I mean, what kind of country, I mean, we proudly say we are the 5th largest economy, we are the most populous country, India will rise, etc. If all that is true, at least on basics, draw your lines and stand by those lines. And I feel today that for me, if a neighbor attacks my cities, destabilizes a state, ambushes my military, I don't think it should be business as usual. And I think that's the national mood.
Minister, traditionally India has been a leader of the non-aligned movement. How do you see India's role in the global order evolving in the coming years?
Look, non-alignment movement was outcome of a time when there were these two Soviet and American-led camps. That has changed. So in many ways, that very sharp requirement for non-alignment is not the way it used to be before. But I think there is still a requirement in the world for independent-minded countries, countries who will not necessarily subject their national interests and positions to the whims and fancies of others, who would like to make their voice and their interests heard. So I would still say I'm not hung up about the label, but I do believe that there is a wide body. I mean, if you take 200 countries in the world, I think there are at least maybe 80 to 100 countries who would want to take more independent position and who look to us in many respects, saying, you're a big country, please, sort of speak out. We would like you to speak out.
Sir, you worked with Dr. Manmohan Singh and you were the key person in negotiating the Indo-US civil nuclear deal. Now you have been working with Prime Minister Modi. What has been your experience and what has been the difference?
Look, first of all, my own, when I was during Dr. Manmohan Singh's tenure, I was the head of division dealing with the US. I was ambassador in Singapore, China. I was basically in my diplomatic career. Under Prime Minister Modi, I came back as the civil service head of the foreign ministry, and today as a political person. So first of all, I myself have such a diverse experience between the two. It's an experience which is very hard to compare. Secondly, I would say having worked with both, obviously more closely with Prime Minister Modi because I was more senior in a way, you can say. But for me, each one was a experience of a very different kind. Obviously, I grew. For me, it was an opening of my awareness and my understanding. So I would really say, okay, this was this and that was that. I would not. No, I honestly, it's not something I would necessarily get into a comparison at all.
That's a very diplomatic answer, sir. Yeah. Pakistan's Imran Khan played your videos at his campaign rallies as an example of national pride. And in Sri Lanka, your videos of standing up to European hypocrisy has gone viral. Do you feel, with your assertiveness and straight talk, you have become the face of South Asian pride? And has the time come for South Asian nations to assert itself in global geopolitics?
Oh, look, you make me sound very combative, and I'm not here. But I tell you what happens, because this is how it actually evolves in a way. people try to put you under pressure. Now, see, you're a very nice guy, you're speaking to me not everybody has treated me like that, it's sometimes you're made to sit and almost scold it, saying, how can India do this? How do you take this position? This is, so at that stage you ask yourself, saying, what do you do? Do you then be conciliatory, or do you put your point of view across? And if somebody is being very self-centered, they're only looking at their interest, their point of view, not by rights tell them that there are other points of view and there are other interests, etc. So I think there are moments when it is, as I said, with nice people you're nice. With difficult people, sometimes it's necessary to push back. But I would say this, because this has been my experience in the last year, a lot of countries in different ways today are feeling, they are feeling pushed. They are feeling that they're not being heard. And to the extent they see others who are pushing back, I think, as I said, they may take solace from it. Sometimes they take courage from it. Many of them kind of say, okay, I can't do it, but I'm glad you're doing it. So there's a bit of that.
I have another question along those lines. This is from your fellow diplomat related. When you were assertive about the Europeans, Dr. Shashi Tharoor said, you must not have such a thin skin and must cool it. Would you agree? Or do you feel we have had a thick skin for too long towards Western hypocrisy, and now it's time to shed it and stand up for it?
Look, I actually, on certain matters, have a thick skin. On certain matters, have a thin skin. When people say, you can say like personal stuff, I tend to have, I'm trying to develop a thick skin, okay? It's part of my political incarnation. So I don't respond to some tweets, as you notice. But on certain matters, I don't think it's a thin skin issue. I mean, I ask you a question, because I think this, the Shashi Tharoor issue came out of that. I mean, when I was in Bangalore that day. I landed in Delhi. I, like everybody, immediately switch on your phone the moment the plane touches down. And I saw that picture of that guy climbing up the flagpole and pulling down our national flag. Honestly, tell me, if you saw it, didn't your blood boil? Do you want me to have a thick skin on that? So I think there are issues. I mean, if somebody sort of, I would say, insults your country or dishonors your what you hold dear, or attacks, your core positions, absolutely, I have a thin skin. I think we should have thin skins.